All right, good afternoon. We're starting out fortunate here in that the panel chose to sit down in the exact order. You're on my sheet here, so I will not call you Bridget. Thank you very much for doing that. So I'm joined by three awesome CEOs as we talk about making sure that the direction and purpose of a company stays true in moments of big disruption like we have today in many industries. So I'm joined by a factory, a drill, and a duck. I'm going to do a brief introduction of all of our guests, and then we're going to hear in their own words about the exciting thing that their company is doing. So first, Mr. Dan Amos, who is the chairman and CEO of Aflac. He has the awesome moment of being the second longest serving CEO in the Fortune 500 behind Warren Buffett, which I think if you're going to be in second place, that's pretty impressive. And is also only the second CEO within Aflac's 63-year history. So I think we're going to get some great examples about the importance of ethics over time. Miss Bridget Macaskill was formerly the CEO of Oppenheimer. And when she came into Oppenheimer, she found a leadership team that had little to no gender diversity. And when she left, 40% of the executive team was female. And we hear lots of talk about that today. This was actually action, so we look forward to hearing about some of that. And then Mr. Blake Moret, who is the CEO of Rockwell Automation. Blake graduated from Georgia Tech in 1985 and got his first job at Rockwell Automation as a sales trainee, rose up 31 years later to become the CEO, and in the dead of winter in Milwaukee, occasionally rides his bike 8 miles to work to show them that the Georgia guys can take the cold. So that is our awesome panel. Please welcome them, all WME winners. And I do want to say congratulations on all of your companies being WME winners. It was a great award ceremony last night, and your teams were very excited to celebrate. So as we start out with, I'm going to pose a question to each of you, a separate question. So we're going to start out with you, Dan. So you've been CEO for 27 years now, and in that time, the place of ethics, the place of social responsibility inside corporations has really changed pretty dramatically. And you shared with me earlier today your experience when you first started leaning into that early in your career. And I think it's a very large difference from where we are today. So if you can just share that story and how you've seen this emerging trend over your time as CEO, it would be great.
Well, if you go back to 1990, most shareholders that we dealt with, their only issue was profitability and how their stock was doing. And I can remember that we decided, I guess it was about 23 years ago, so about 4 years into my tenure, that we wanted to sponsor children's pediatric cancer issues. And there was an opportunity in Atlanta to sponsor Children's Healthcare of Atlanta's Cancer Center. It ended up being called the Aflac Cancer Center. And we had a shareholders meeting coming up. And I was talking to the board, and I said, I think this will play well with the people that we are giving back to the community by helping kids with cancer. When I said it for the shareholders meeting, they said, we don't think it's a good idea to mention the shareholders meeting. So I said, well, okay, I'll tell you what we'll do. We will have the shareholders meeting, and after the shareholders meeting, we'll ask to stay back, and we'll make the presentation on that. 2/3 of the people got up and left after it was over. And today, I would venture that very few, in fact, I have put it in the program since then. We have since raised $125 million for kids with cancer. And of that, about $70 million have come from our employees and our field force who's given money to the Cancer Center. And now we're taking it to the next level of social responsibility. We just won the big award at the Las Vegas
a CES show, which, by the way, when you're CEO of a technology company, that's like the Oscars of technology. So the fact that Aflac came in and won this thing, a lot of people,
and we won
I thought it was pretty awesome.
We just won it with a duck that will kids take. I'd encourage you, if you ever want to do it, is just Google it or look at it. It's called My Special Aflac Duck. And these ducks were so popular, we'll have them ready in September. We're going to give them to every kid that's diagnosed with cancer in the United States. There's 16,000 are diagnosed with cancer. And what it does is it helps the kids relate to, they don't know how to express their feelings at young ages, and so they teach the duck how to do these things. And it has a special cover that you take off and wash because of all the issues regarding...
and this is a robot.
This is a robot. It is an absolute robot. They're right now, they run us about $250 a piece. And we think it's a good thing to give back to the community, and specifically these kids with cancer. So that gives you an idea of the swing of what's taken place in these 27 years.
Got it. Excellent.
Amazing.
And I think to get a duck to all 16,000 children in the United States that are in that horrible, horrible experience is something that is a legacy you can be rather proud of.
We're excited.
Bridget, you've been at JLL now for just a little bit over 18 months as a board role. So you have experience both on the CEO side and understanding what it's like to work with a board to push through direction and vision during times of disruption. Now you find yourself on the other side of the table as a member of the board. And obviously in the real estate world, there's a huge disruption right now. There's the shift of different types of workspaces. There's companies coming in with entire different models that are getting crazy tech valuations. So there's a real moment of disruption in that industry. And JLL is a company that obviously is not a newcomer. It has experience, it has wisdom. And so what are your experiences in how JLL positions itself in the moment of these disruptions? How does that role change when you're on the board side?
I think the advantage that the board can bring to a company, any company, but a company like JLL who's facing some of these kind of disruptions, is a much broader breadth and depth of knowledge and experience from other industries that have faced similar disruptions. And so I think part of the role of the board is to be able to, if you like, step back from the day-to-day running of the organization and to take a kind of longer-term view and to really encourage the management to think about where those disruptions are coming and how we tackle them. And in some cases, that's you can do it in the normal course of the business. The business can evolve in the face of disruption. And I think in some cases you have to almost create a separate unit, a separate piece of the business to try out new ideas, to try sort of disintermediation type technologies that we're facing, to really explore those separately. It's very hard, I think, if you're running a day-to-day JLL business to actually focus on doing both. Focus on making sure that you're running your own business properly and thinking about the disruption. So one of the things that JLL has done is to create a separate entity that really explores the disruptive technologies and thinks about how we can build enabling technologies that will make our businesses more efficient, more streamlined, more cost-effective, and to do it in a way that is sort of incremental to the business rather than just disruptive. There is a lot that technology offers businesses that can actually help and make those businesses more effective and not disintermediate them. So I think we need to look at both sides of that coin. We have a very diverse group of board members. They come from all over the country, all over the world, and all sorts of different backgrounds, including technology background. And I think that's been, hopefully that's very helpful to the company to have that perspective.
So you first started as the CEO nearly 20 years ago in your time at Oppenheimer. And building on this idea that Dan talked about, how have you seen that evolution of, rule number one was make sure you're not in the newspaper unless your PR team got you there, exactly. Right? Which is the world in the 1990s to now with the court of public opinion, with the fact that, we have 450 reporters here and that everybody has a voice, is how have you seen that evolution going from the CEO's office now to the board, and how you encourage and coach and guide how companies fit into this conversation, as we heard last night, finding their own voice, taking their stand that's the right stand. How do you think about that as a board member now?
Well, it's certainly changed. It used to be that, the rule was that you better keep in with reporters so that anything bad happened, you could kind of manage the issue. I think now the idea of sort of controlling your reputation after the event, whatever the event is really something that is out of our control, because social media will take over and your reputation is destroyed before you have time to blink. And therefore, the only way to do it is to think really hard about what could destroy your reputation. What are the things that could happen in an organization that could actually allow your reputation to be damaged very quickly? And that means that both boards and management have to be very vigilant about making sure that we do business in the way that we think is the right way to do business. It feeds very much into the issue of culture and ethics, and trying to ensure that you build a culture and you build a feeling of responsibility in an organization that will really try to protect your reputation so that it prevents something happening. Because once something bad goes wrong, it's really, really hard to control it these days. Right. So I think from a board's point of view, we have a responsibility to make sure that those strong ethical values are embedded in the organization. Real estate industry, as a generality, doesn't always have the best reputation. I think JLL is a big exception to that and has a very strong reputation of being an ethical company in the real estate business. But those things don't happen without work. They have to be reinforced. You have to reward the right behaviors. You have to call out the wrong behaviors. And that has to come from the top. The top being not just the board, but importantly the CEO. So I think it's more important than ever that you really focus on the things that could destroy your reputation, and you make very, very sure that you do everything you can to prevent that happening.
Excellent. And Blake, we'll come to you in just a moment, but I'm going to switch back to you, Dan, because of a story you shared earlier that I think really plays on this. So this idea that you can't control the conversation afterwards, it's the actions that you take. You shared a story about actually the voice of the duck, and something that happened right after the tsunami in Japan. Was that, I think, 5-6 years ago? And I think it's a great example of what Bridget was just talking about, in that, A, it can't be managed, and sometimes you have to make really fast decisions. So I think you should share that story.
Well, first of all, 75% of our business is in Japan. We insure 1 out of 4 households over there. And so it's an enormous business for us. So I go back and forth to Japan. And I got a call from a reporter 5 years ago, and he said, I wanted to know, Gilbert Gottfried was the voice of the Aflac duck in the United States, but not in Japan. That's another story. But anyway, and said that Gilbert Gottfried had made these comments that were terrible as jokes, and he had put them out on the internet. And
following the tsunami.
Following the tsunami, right. And, I was caught off guard, and they said, would you like to comment on that? And I said, well, I don't know what they are. Well, they told me. And I said, uh-oh, we got problems here. And I said, will you give me 30 minutes? And I'll get back with you to an answer, because I knew if I didn't respond and said, I'll give you an answer tomorrow. And if you go back when I was CEO in the beginning, you didn't have that issue. They had a date that they had to have at a time for the paper the next day, but other than that, you didn't see it. So all of a sudden, they're going to put out this article on the internet. So he gave me 30 minutes, and so I called our group together, and I said, we got to fire him. So in 30 minutes, we called the agency, fired him, had to pull every commercial we had on TV off the air, and had to come up with a voice of the Aflac duck. And we ended up taking a negative and making it into a positive. We ended up letting people audition for the voice of the Aflac duck, which paid $100,000 a year.
Pretty good quack.
So pretty good quack. So we ended up getting $45 million worth of free advertising. We were on all 3 major networks. We had 16,000 people interviewed to be the voice of the Aflac duck, and a person that none of us know that's located in Minnesota his voice was the one we ended up choosing. And it ended up turning into something very positive for us. And sometimes tough decisions you just have to make. And, knowing you were pulling every commercial on TV was something, but you got to do what's right, and you had to stand up, and you can't let that happen. And so it ended up being the right decision for us, and I was glad we made it.
Great. So Blake, you start your career at Rockwell Automation. You're one of the people at the water cooler, sharing your opinion whenever you want your opinion to be heard, and you're on the side of the culture where it's easy to nitpick the things that aren't great. And then January 1st of this year, suddenly there's no more water cooler. You step into the CEO's office. It's a culture that's identified with every aspect of your career. It's what you know. It's in your heart. It's in your soul. What was that moment like when you step into that opportunity to be that next person responsible for driving the culture forward, for driving the ethics, for driving the foundation of that organization forward? Because that had to be an awesome responsibility.
Well, it was a bit of a surprise. I moved into the CEO role in July of 2016. In January this year, I moved and took the chair as well. And in both cases, it was more of a jolt than I really expected. I mean, when I moved into the CEO role, I had been announced, and I walked into that office, and it felt pretty quiet walking in there, and it felt different. I thought, no, everybody knows that this is happening on this day. I did ride my bike in that day, by the way. But you walk in and you realize that there's a lot of eyes on you, and things that you do are going to be interpreted in a lot of different ways. So you have to be consistent, and you have to make sure that you're getting the message out. And then there's that second step, taking the chair position, and you recognize even more, that's the governance, and you're responding when you have fires at that level. They're big fires, and what you do has to be precise, and you can't just make it up on the way. So having a well-managed risk management framework, and practicing in some ways. You can't practice for everything, but that's an important part of it. And then finally, I would say, walking the walk is much more important than just the words that you're voicing, because people are watching really close to see whether you believe what you're saying in a variety of ways, and ethics is certainly part of that. And while the people who help you, write your speeches and put your messages out on the intranet and so on can help, you can't let them take over, because they're people who've known you for a while, and they know when it's not your voice. And so it has to be your voice, and you have to put the effort into it, because these are the pieces of evidence that people who work for you and people who are looking to be associated with the company look for to make some really important decisions about whether this is the company that they want to be associated with.
So I want a follow-on question there. So when you talked about the consistency of the message, and when you talked about how do you build consensus around that message, if you could dig into that a little bit further, because again, it is a big, when you take that step from being one of the violin players to being the conductor, it's different when you're trying to develop that consensus, and what happens when you can't reach consensus, and how did that happen in your first 6 or 12 months? If you could share some of those moments.
Well, I tell you, I had to go through a fairly protracted interview process before coming into the role, and as such, it gave me an opportunity under some, pretty trying circumstances to pressure test the things that I'd always thought were important about the company and the culture, and to refine the message. And so, by the time I moved into the role, I felt pretty strong about 4 main elements of our culture. And one was the willingness to compare ourselves with the very best in a variety of ways that was available to our customers and to our employees. The other was the increased speed of decision making. The third was making sure that we would have a steady stream of new ideas, and a lot of that would come from acquisitions. And the fourth was the continued commitment to a culture of integrity and inclusion, because I felt, that's what a lot of employees were looking for. And also, it was consistent with our whole strategy of delivering long-term value, as opposed to doing things short-term to maximize short-term results.
So one of the things that we talked about last night at the WME is finding the voice of an organization in today's times, where I think there's somewhat of a vacuum of where people are turning for trust. And there was some research that showed that 7 out of 10 people felt the most important job of the CEO was making sure that the voice of the company and the trust of the company in the marketplace was clear and concise. And that could even be more important. It was actually ranked higher even than research and development, et cetera. So if you can spend a little bit of time, Dan, talking about that, is that where has Aflac taken a step forward in social responsibility, and how do you make sure that the true voice of Aflac is getting out, and then actually, more importantly, coming inside the organization and being consistent?
Well, I think as you think about a corporation, as it was said, I don't know which one said it, but it only takes a second to destroy the brand that you have. You spend a lifetime building it, and it can get destroyed in a moment, and it can get destroyed with things we don't even expect. It can come from any direction. So you have to constantly be managing and trying to play what-if scenarios of what's out there and what can take place. The obvious thing that everyone worries about is IT security nowadays, and whether or not people can get hold of the information that you have, being an insurance company, their health issues, and so you're trying to make sure all those things are protected. Within that scope, how does it relate to the employees? You have to make them know that we're just not going to put up with any unethical behavior, and that's the foundation under which we operate, and we have to be that way, and we have to protect the brand, and they're a part of that brand, and you have to make them feel that they're part of it, and we work real hard at doing that over the years. We've had 20 years in a row where we've been best place to work in America. We've been best place for minorities, for Hispanics, and I can prove it in that my head of U.S. operations is an African-American female. My general counsel is an African-American female. My head of IT is a female, and the list goes on. I have 4 female board members. I have 2 African-Americans and 2 Japanese out of the 12, so over 70% of the company is made up of minorities at the board level. So all of that speaks to how important it is. We were, and so we have to constantly keep that in front of them and let them know that that's what's important to us. And then when you kind of tie it together with everyone enjoys being associated with the Aflac Cancer Center with the children, that has made a difference, and all of us feel a part of it, and a lot of the employees donate to it and make the difference. So, and then it's the little things, I think, that matter going to the CEO. I mean, I write every employee that retires with the company over 20 years a handwritten note. That doesn't sound like much, but it takes a while. And I've been around long enough that I know most of them, believe it or not. And so I try to do that. And it's just a little, we have what we call Employee Appreciation Week. And I always say, I know my secretary, I know the person that's a receptionist, but there's somebody in a corner over there that I don't know in one of the other buildings located at different places. And so during that week, we do something every day for them to let them know we appreciate them in May when we have that. And then we end up giving them options to where they can go to Six Flags over Georgia in Atlanta, or they can go to these different things to tell them we appreciate them. And that's part of that culture of just making them feel like it's important, and we try to do that.
So you started several years ago doing surveys internally to understand how your team members and employees inside the organization view the organization. What is it that you learned from that? What were some of the surprises that you took away from that corporate sustainability reports and surveys that you did?
Well, it's not money that drives people. It's recognition and feeling like they're making a difference. Yeah. That's where these bots are coming into play, where people hate doing redundancy. If they're making decisions at the job, they like it, but they don't like to just do something over and over. So that's where technology is playing, and they don't seem to want to do it anyway, so it's worked out very well for us in that regard. But I think those are examples of what you have to do.
Got it. Blake, when you and I were on the phone several weeks ago getting prepared for this conversation, you shared something that I have admittedly told a few people about. We were talking about where does a company like Rockwell, which isn't in the B2B world, it doesn't have to react immediately to a Parkland, to a something, that your customer, and the question that I was asking is how important is your voice as a CEO on these societal issues? And you responded to me in a very interesting way, which you talked about what the most important documents inside Rockwell are for one of your most important customers, which is hiring extraordinary young people into the firm like you were hired 31 years ago. And so if you can take what Dan shared and pick up on that, because I was thinking about the external world and you immediately brought it to those emerging team members.
Yeah. Well, I had mentioned that our corporate social responsibility documentation, our brochure, is probably our most important recruiting tool. And, regardless of where you are in the organization in terms of title or age, I think, there's a few things that are that you think about when you're looking at where you want to work and where you want to keep working. One is that most people want to know that the work that they're doing is important, and I think that gets to Dan's comment that purely rote, repetitive work it doesn't give the same dignity as when you're providing decision-making input as well, and so they want to know that that work is important and that you're doing it for a company that's doing important things and doing it the right way. The second is that people want to have the tools and the support to be able to do a good job, and that's in terms of just having the right equipment, but it's also in terms of being in a culture that they feel like not only they can do the best work, but they actually want to do their best work for that company. And then finally, that they want to have a chance to be able to move forward in their careers. And I think those, when I test that out against, my kids who are now entering the workforce, and I think about people who are, my age, who are, in the company that I've known for many years, I think those are some common denominators there. And that corporate social responsibility report now says, here's who we are. And, good times and bad, this isn't something we just put out when times are good and we got extra money. This is what we do in the depths of the recession, and this is what we do when the company is, doing great financially as well.
Bridget, so coming back to the board role in this, certainly as when you were leading an organization, you understood the importance of hearing the voices coming in from your Oppenheimer team members around the world. But now as a board member at JLL, when you look at the CSR results that you read about and the survey results, how does that change when your job is really to think in real long-term and guidance? How is that role differently, and how do you see that data, and what is it that you're looking for?
I think part of the answer to that question is the answer to the difference between being a board member and an executive. I mean, you have to understand that your role as a board member is certainly to guide, certainly to ask questions, certainly to make suggestions, but it's not to execute. So we're not there to tell the chief executive what to do. We are there to ask the questions and to engage in dialogue and to ask whether we're doing enough. Are we focusing on these questions enough? And to try to ensure that there is consistent commitment to the corporate social responsibility piece of the organization. And for a company like JLL, that takes multiple forms. And we're in the buildings business, and buildings have an enormous impact on the environment. And because we are in the business of designing and running buildings and managing buildings, we can have a real impact in that area. It also takes a form of a more inward-looking form. One of the things that has been a big focus of JLL recently, and great credit to my colleague Mark over there, who has been instrumental in this, is that JLL's workforce has changed dramatically in the last 10 or 15 years as the business has changed. It used to be largely a white-collar professional services business. Now we have 80,000 employees, and a lot of them are working in buildings. They're maintaining buildings. They're maintenance people. They're security people. So suddenly we have a whole issue about the security of our employees that we never really had to focus on 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. So now we have much more focus on how do we make sure we take care of these people, and how do we actually have statistics that, you know, until a few years ago we didn't collect because we didn't need to make sure that we are taking the right measures to be careful and to keep these people secure. So I think the role of the board is to raise those kind of questions, to raise those issues, to ask the right questions, and then to follow up to make sure that we are doing as much as we should be doing. And normally, in my experience, not just with JLL, but with different companies and different boards, the company's generally non-resistant in the slightest bit. The reaction to somebody saying, so what's your safety record like, or how do you maintain safety statistics is, oh my goodness, I don't know that we're doing enough. Let's think about that. Let's work on it. Let's put it in place. So they're generally very receptive, but that's a very, I think, important role for the board to play, is to raise issues that the management maybe haven't thought about. They maybe haven't seen it from a different perspective. And so I think that's part of what we try to do.
Right. So, Blake, you're in the business of making factories better, more efficient. And obviously, if you look over the last 30 years, starting with environmentalism, and that was about not polluting, to now actually trying, how have you in your 31 years at Rockwell watched the company go from reacting to maybe a regulatory hurdle that got put in place, how do we keep this from happening, to actually turning that around and being able to look at your kids and being able to look at your new employees coming into the workforce and say, we're not doing this to avoid a law, we're actually doing this because we can make an impact, because we can make it better. Because that's a really big shift that's happened in the business world over the last 30 years.
It is, and I'd say over the last 10 years, I think it really picked up probably around 2007, 2008 in our industry, where people recognize that conservation is a form of efficiency. And they probably hadn't thought about it that way as much in the past, but you know, running motors, getting a little in the weeds, but you know, running motors at lower speeds than full out all the time is a huge way to save energy consumption in factories today, and that's a big part of our business today. Being able to sample particulate, exhaust, and to be able to control the process so that things are, the combustion process runs more efficiently. That's a big part of what we do every day. And so being able to look at that, helping with renewables. We do a lot of work helping solar energy providers and wind energy providers be more efficient. Those are the things that I can talk about with my kids. They understand that very quickly. Now, to be sure, we're also helping the oil companies do what they're doing more efficiently and so on. But the general idea is that conservation, getting the most out of scarce resources, whether they're raw materials or whether they're people, the most important resource of all, that's what we do.
So how do you, as a CEO, when you're in conversations and someone raises the question that you just brought up, that you're making oil companies more efficient, yeah, and in this unknown as the world goes through its shift in energy, how do you, as a CEO of a company, in this idea of finding the voice of the company, how does that then fit into the larger mission and vision of Rockwell?
Well, the mission of the company is to increase the sustainability of the world's resources and also to increase people's standard of living. So, and energy is an important part of that equation for increasing people's standard of living. And today, a lot of that is met with fossil fuel, but as renewables are growing in importance, faster than I think anybody thought, then that's also an important part of what we're doing, and we're assisting in that. And across the entire spectrum, we're helping people convert that energy as efficiently as possible. And so that's the way that we talk about it.
So, Bridget, Convercent is headquartered in Denver, Colorado. And Denver just passed an interesting law in November of last year. It was a referendum just inside the city, so not at the state level, at the city level, stating that I believe it's any building over 25,000 square feet of roof space, that 80% of that roof had to be either solar or organic matter, i.e. you can stick a bocce ball court up on the roof. And it was a very disputed measure. Certainly a lot of the development community felt like that was a great deal of additional cost. It actually overwhelmingly passed. It was like 65% passed. We're now dealing with the ramifications of that because you have very different laws in different areas. And actually at Convercent, we're caught up in that as well right now with the new building we're going into. So you see now these societal decisions happening at the local level, at the state level, more so even than at the federal level, which was the case in the 80s and 90s. How does JLL, not specific to the Denver ordinance, but how do you as a board member work with your CEO as you walk through these minefields of not having an opinion, right? You kind of have to have one way or the other. So how do you, with your experience, coach the leadership team on how to go through that initiative or the next 50 inevitably that will be like that coming down the road in the next 5-10 years?
I think the issue that CEOs face in some of these situations is sometimes there's a conflict between what it means for the organization, how much it's going to cost them, what they have to do differently to meet these ordinances, and sometimes a personal reaction that actually this is a good thing. So how do you bring those two together?
Great question.
I think that where it works best and where an organization finds its voice best is if you can try and ensure there's some consistency in those two. So for a CEO to have a voice or be the voice of a company in a way that is not totally consistent with what that company is trying to do, I think causes difficulty and issues. But normally, I think if you sit down and you really thrash the thing out and you really think, if our voice is going to stand for whatever it is that something we can live with for a long time? Can we live with it for 20 years? Do we really want to be associated with this? And what ramifications can it have around the world? You're as international as Aflac is or JLL is. You're not just thinking about what the voice of the company is in the States, but how will that play in all the other 79 countries that we operate in? So I think that it really has to be thought about very, very carefully. We can take a position on a local issue, but somehow that has to be consistent with a bigger, broader overall position. And I think companies are beginning to realize how important it is to do that. I mean, one of the most exciting things I think that is beginning to happen now is that companies are stepping in where governments are leaving a void. And they're doing so in a very positive way and in a very brave way in some cases, and really stepping up to the plate and saying that this is wrong or this is right. They're prepared to support climate change when the government doesn't. I mean, I think that corporations have a real opportunity at the moment to make their voices heard in support of these subjects. And I think it's happening more and more, but I think it has to be consistent with the culture and the ethics and the mission of the company. Otherwise, you can get into trouble.
Yeah, I think just to build on that, I think one of the reasons companies are filling that void is what you said, that you have to consider your decisions and are they going to be durable for 15, 20 years? And that's longer than, an election cycle. And so that's, people are ironically, in some cases, turning to companies for sort of that more durable moral compass on certain things.
And companies have the advantage that, yes, shareholders elect the CEO in some sense, But it's not like an election cycle, and so you have the ability, if you have the courage, to actually make a stand and take a stand in a way that politicians, I think, are finding increasingly difficult to do.
So this is a really interesting point that you brought up, Bridget, that I'm going to turn to you now, Dan, because unique to the way that our other two panelists served in CEO roles, yours is a little bit more personal. Your family was one of the founding families of Aflac. You're the second CEO to serve. You're in Columbus, Georgia, a city that it's a small town. Everywhere you go, you know, your waiter at dinner could very well be a shareholder that wants to talk buybacks. You have activist shareholders everywhere. What is it like when you think about this idea that Bridget brought up, in that you've got the company's viewpoint, you have Dan's viewpoint, there's the ideas that your family used when, and sometimes those things can become a triangle of different viewpoints, right? And then you're surrounded by people that you know intimately in a city like Columbus. That's got to be an interesting juxtaposition to find yourself in.
It is. I generally think, though, that what Bridget said is right, is you've got to have a foundation on which you believe certain things, and you stay. I'll give you an idea, and they always say don't talk religion or politics, but I will say this. We have a position in politics at the corporate level, and the corporate level is we support whoever is not against us that's the incumbent. And we don't run into that much. But we give almost, in our PACs and things, we give almost, it's about 48-52, Democrat, Republican. So it's not that we're either one. And the reason I say that is sometimes you just don't want, in business where you just want to be left alone from the standpoint of running your business. Mm-hmm. And so you try to position yourself in a way that you're not tied to every aspect of a party or anything else. And so that helps us to some degree in trying to stay neutral on issues. Now, there are issues out there that we want to engage with, and we want to, for example, you know, we're very interested, from an insurance perspective, you're not going to have the impact of real estate or manufacturing. But we also want our buildings up to the new standards, and we've been working. We originally called it the Green Committee, and now it's the Sustainability Committee of the board. But we've been very engaged in trying to get our buildings all up to, because we do believe there's only so much renewable energy out there, and you need to try to control those things. So we're always looking for ways to address those issues that will come up. And the other thing we try to do is look what is the movement ahead, and go ahead and come up with a stance on it. If we know something that's coming into the news or in the forefront, do we need to be positioned on that? Do we need to know that? Again, that's part of risk management, of going back and reviewing and decide, well, these issues are important to us, and we want to be on such and such, like making sure we're as green as we possibly can be. We decided we wanted to participate in that and be one of the top green type companies that are out there in America today.
And it's interesting. So we're going to dig into a little kind of specific example here. So immigration, something that is interestingly that so many companies in America were founded with immigrants, whether they're at the leadership level or at the team member level, technology companies, manufacturing companies, all sorts. It's an item that really can go either way from a political viewpoint. And yet today, it's interesting, some of the loudest voices on immigrations are actually CEOs. You know, Satya at Microsoft is an absolute at the forefront of having that conversation. And then equally, you have companies that are in more conservative places that are in agriculture that also have very strong opinions. And so these are items that are you finding inside the boardroom and the executive room, there's the way of looking at it that you can put together a plan and try to come up with a strategy. But then there's also the authenticity and the rawness of this really important topic inside this moment of American history. And what we're seeing in all of the research is people are turning to the CEOs. They are turning to the leadership of the companies. They want to know their opinions, right? And there's no right or wrong answer. That's the tough thing here. It isn't like 1 + 1 is 2 and you kind of know, right? There are different viewpoints. And so I would love to hear from the panelists, both on the board and the executive side, of how do you, in a real authentic way, consistent with the company values, go through a situation like that, which I understand even now is an ongoing conversation. So it's not the outcome as much as it is the process.
Well, I think from a board standpoint, you have to first make sure the board's diverse. It can't be made up of a group of 60-year-old white guys. That is not going to cut it. It's got to be a group of diverse people that represent the U.S. or the world, whatever it may be, in particular to have those discussions. Because, and so that's important as they're deciding whatever that particular issue is. And I think the issues depend, for example, when it's health insurance or Obamacare or issues like that, I'm going to get calls wanting to know more about that than I will other issues that are out there. So it depends on what issues that, people are concerned with trade or issues like that. I'll get more questions on from U.S.-Japan standpoint. So I find that it depends on the business you're in whether you get more questions or not, or that's certainly been our case, more so than others.
And sometimes, though, this is extraordinarily fast-moving. You look at, the situation from Parkland to Delta. I mean, that was literally 48 hours where, going back to a state-level law that then was coming in on tax incentives, right? All of that happens so fast. It's not like you can call the board meeting and sit down and so how are you seeing that, Blake? You're new into the role. You're not even at 2 years yet. And things are moving at a speed that the conference room can no longer always be the solution to, getting everybody inside the panels and having this thoughtful conversation.
Well, just first a comment that there's no place like this where you can better prove out the idea that diverse teams make better decisions, because when you have something that is intentionally emotional for people, to make sure that you've got those different viewpoints, and also that you speak when you finally coalesce a certain viewpoint as a company, that you can speak with heart about those things, because these are intensely personal things, and to do it in just cold language like you would talk about profit and loss and so on, it doesn't get it, and it doesn't connect with the people that you're trying to communicate with. So I think that's important. Now, we spend a lot of time going through and structuring our positions and thinking through those and testing them and retesting them. A lot of that is for share owners, but it's useful for talking with all the other stakeholders that we have, and to go through and to create that framework as to what do we think about certain things. Because the worst thing would be for me to try to ad-lib, and you would get some confusing mess of personal opinions and unformed ideas, and it's important at that moment to be able to communicate clearly the way that we think about certain things. And sometimes we don't take a position on certain issues that don't have a straight line connection with either our employees or our business, and we have to be prepared to say that as well.
So I want to take a moment and see if we have questions. We have some awesome experience up here on the stage. I want to see if we had questions from the audience. All right. We will continue on to the next page. Bridget, I'd like to come back to you talked about and I know you've only been at JLL for 2 years, but you talked about this really big shift in a company where you have an organization that's mostly the brokers, the white collar roles that are working to bring companies and real estate together so that they can go do great things, into really being the services business that tacked a whole nother business onto it that changes the makeup, the diversity, the thinking, the actions of the company. How has that impacted the viewpoint of what was a much less diverse group of folks 10 years ago to where it is today, where there's lots of different inputs coming into the company?
Well, it's interesting because not only has the type of roles changed, but the geographic footprint has changed enormously also. And so when you talk about diversity within JLL, we even have trouble sometimes defining how to measure diversity. Because if you have an Indian working in Chicago, that can be diverse. If you have an Indian working in India, or you have a Filipino working in India, where do you draw the lines around diversity? So it becomes a very interesting discussion. But starting at the board level, we have board members represented. We have 4 women on the board, including the chairman. We have a board member from India, a board member from China, board member from Latin America. So we have a very diverse board. And I think those points of view are, and Europeans, I might add, but those points of view, you do get real diversity of opinion, of thought. You get disagreement in people's perspectives, which is very healthy. And I think that it's, of all the boards that I've been on, and I've been on a few, I think JLL is the best example of that, of where people really bring a different opinion about things that are happening in the business. I think it makes us very aware of the fact that we're now operating with a very broad geographic footprint, and not everything that is devised in the United States works everywhere else, and that we really have to think about how we take something that makes absolute sense to us sitting in the States and translate it into another country, and be very careful about how we do that, because something that we can think is obvious and sort of unquestionable, translated into another culture is very difficult. And it translates also into how you take your corporate culture, how you adapt it, but how you try to maintain the essence of it. So for JLL, we have 3 corporate values. We have ethics, we have excellence, and we have teamwork. Those you can actually spread pretty successfully around the world. What is ethical in one country and what is ethical in another country becomes also another challenge. But if you don't talk about those values all the time, if you don't reinforce them all the time and all the way around the world, then you have no hope. Can you do it perfectly? Can you take that concept of diverse thought and diverse cultures and marry them with your corporate culture? It's a big challenge. And I don't think any of us would deny that challenge. But I also think that the bigger the challenge, the more important it is to tackle it. And the more dispersed your company is, the more countries that you cover, the more important it is to have a sense of corporate purpose and a sense of corporate culture, because that is what knits the company together. It's what makes diversity work. So it's not, I wouldn't say it was easy by any stretch of the imagination, but the board spends a lot of time talking about those issues and thinking about how we do shape the culture of the company to make it work as the company changes.
Great, thank you. Well, Blake, Dan, Bridget, thank you very much for ending a very successful day 1 at the Global Ethics Summit. We look forward to having further conversations tomorrow. And I hope everybody has a wonderful evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.